Hey, we are live with the Depression Cure Get Connected, Chapter 8, Part 2. So we're going to talk about social connections and friendships and relationships today and why they're important for depression and battling depression. So one of the things that we're going to start with is friendship. Depression can take a huge toll on friendships. In fact, for those friends who don't understand, the disorder characteristic of withdrawal can really be frustrating and hurtful, even for friends who understand and recognize what mental illness is. You still have that sense of rejection because it never feels good when a friend starts avoiding you, even if it's not intentionally. But those who suffer from the disorder commonly feel like they're actually doing their friends a service by backing away and pulling away because they think they're not worth spending time with. So we're going to talk about 3 steps that are important if you want to reestablish those friendships in depression with those of you who have depression, to reestablish the friendships. So number 1 is to disclose. Disclose with your friends what you're going through. And most often, those friends are going to have support and they're going to be willing to be with you side by side, help you through those things, and break the stigma of depression. Number 2 is educate them. Educate them on why you're doing what you're doing. Depression is an illness. It typically leads to the victim withdrawing from friends and loved ones, and social support can play an important role in the recovery process. And number 3, ask your friends to be there if they're willing to help. One of the most useful things is to spend regular time with your friends, doing things that don't lead to rumination, so anti-ruminating activities that will take the depressed person out of those situations where they want to ruminate and keep going over those depressive thoughts. So shared activities such as walking, working out, going to get a meal, dinner or lunch together, playing games, going to a concert, anything you like to do socially with your friend, do that. Those are all good things. So when you're with friends, you also want to avoid negativity. Sometimes people that are depressed will say things negatively like reassurance seeking, like, oh, let me give an example. This girl said, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be so hard to be around. That's the only thing I'm good at right now, making people upset." And really, instead of trying to reassure a friend, so this is for the supporter, and instead of trying to reassure the depressed, try to change the subject and do something interactive or change the subject so they're not focused on that anymore. So spending time with others is helpful in part because it's a powerful way to interrupt rumination, but it can do so only if the social interaction centers on something other than depressing thoughts themselves. So avoid reassurance seeking. Plan social interactions as much as possible around shared activities. So to lift the mood and shift the brain into a less negative mode of thinking, it's important to just ignore those reassurance statements or comments. And they can also be addictive for the depressed because it's someone who's already feeling insecure, and it can program them to become even tougher on themselves. So they're not doing it on purpose. So just try to ignore it and change the subject. So one of the things that Dr. Ilardi said in his classes is that he had his students make a list of their friends, their closest friends, and a lot of them on the list were actually far away, like too far to spend time with. So he challenged them to make a connection with these people that were far away, because now more than at any time we can connect with people across the globe. It makes it so easy. And in most cases, the patients found it was enormously helpful to reconnect with their old friends. So video chats are a great way to reconnect because there's something about seeing someone that brings that energy. And then also internet friends. So there are a lot of internet chat rooms and forums that bring encouragement and support. I know there's a lot of Facebook groups also about depression and being supportive in those situations. So make sure we touched on all of that. So one of the questions was, well, if I connect with an old friend, should I tell them about my depression? And yes, tell them about your depression. Don't dwell on the problems, like make it a short, like few minutes that you're talking about it, and then talk to them about pretty much anything. Catch up with them, ask them questions, anything that you have common interests, or talk about your common acquaintances, just anything. There is an important type of relationship that we all are aware of, which are toxic relationships. And toxic relationships stand as a major obstacle in the path of recovery. Sometimes both parties have depression, and so they'll get together and they'll ruminate together, and that's not good. And so if the friend that you know also has depression, you could set a timer. Like if you wanted to talk about things, like set a timer for 5 minutes to talk about those things, and then move on to something else and do something else. So both parties have to avoid the temptation of dwelling on negative thoughts, since joint rumination is particularly damaging to those with depression. So it's a really good idea that you might want to write out a list of people you know that like are sunny and make deliberate efforts of being kind and happy and uplifting, and then you try to spend more time with those people and see how you're feeling. You could also limit the amount of time you're spending with the people that have negativity. There was an example he shared about this girl that was in college, and she was trying to fit in, and so she was in this group of girls in her sorority, but they were just like the mean girls. Like they were popular, but for some reason they were, I don't know how they're popular, because they were so mean. They didn't treat her right, even though she didn't do anything. They were mean to her often, but she couldn't break the ties with them. So when Dr. Ilardi talked to her, she was actually well on her way to improvement in her depression, but when he talked to her, he gave her a challenge to go and meet some of the girls that weren't mean, that she had noticed that were much more uplifting. But it was really hard, because it's sometimes those toxic relationships, you are tied to them. It is hard to let go of, no matter how destructive they might be, because there's always a hope of acceptance, love, approval, protection that you're hoping will come, and so you're hanging on. But the step is recognizing that sometimes those toxic relationships are actually damaging, and those are the link that is hanging on to healing. Like you can't heal until you cut the ties of those toxic relationships. So this college girl ended up breaking those ties, hanging out with some other girls, and it totally helped her on her path to recovery. So you might wondering, like, when do I let go in a toxic relationship? And Dr. Ilardi says, ask yourself this question: do I usually feel worse when I spend time with this person? If so, you need to identify what it is about the interaction that's causing distress, and whether or not it's something that can be improved. Sometimes, of course, people find themselves in a relationship that are clearly toxic beyond repair, and so that's definitely like abusive situations, those malicious girls, and those harmful relationships are pretty easy to spot, and that is when you need to cut the ties. Even though sometimes it can be hard, your healing is more important than those relationships, for sure. So let's talk a little bit about spouses. This was a really cool part for me, because I am the spouse. And spouses, although the principles we've covered so far can be applied to any relationship, they can also be applied to spouses. So when a person is caught in the grips of depression, a spouse can play a really important role. They can be an invaluable resource, because they can help in two ways. They can help by setting up social situations and interactions and bringing the spouse into those. And they are an unwavering social support to their spouse, so the social aspect of depression, but also just being there as a presence is also helpful, like the presence of and the touch of holding hands. That can really help in the frontal cortex actually initiate a stress relieving hormone, even if you're not doing anything but just sitting next to the person or holding their hand. So it takes great care to make sure this brain-inspired nudging, it's important for the spouse to nudge, like nudge your partner into the right direction if you're the one supporting a loved one with depression. But what you need to do is communicate. Like, sit down with your loved one and make a plan. Communicate openly. Like, is it okay if I remind you? Are you okay if we have this open conversation, and so we can set up some ground rules? When can I nudge you? Are there things that are off limits that you'd rather not, that I encourage you to do or talk about or nudge you? So making sure there's clear lines in communication is so important. Just a minute, hon. I'm on this call. So spouses are also important because, like I said, their physical presence and planning and engaging activities together, but that open communication is the first line that needs to happen, the first big thing that needs to happen. Finally, it's important to note that no spouse can serve as an effective resource for their depressed partner if they're not first taking care of themselves and their own well-being. And I found that to be true. I've actually come quite a long way in my journey with caring, being a support for my spouse. Like, I've had moments of a lot of self-doubt and codependency traits that I've found in myself that I've been working through and healing through, and being able to have my own emotional well-being strong so I can be a support to him is really important. Making sure I have my personal self-care, because otherwise, when you're with those negative people, it goes two ways. Either they can pull you down and rub off on you, and then you start getting depressed, or you can be positive and hopefully rub off on that person. So it goes two ways, but you need to make sure you're in that positive state if you're the supporter and taking care of yourself. And I love this section. There's a section about giving, and this is awesome because gratitude and service are huge in mindset. And so one of the best things about the recovery process, and also, I guess, anytime you're feeling down, is if you just stop thinking about yourself and turn around and think of someone else. So it's more blessed to give than to receive. That's a proverb. And there was a professor named Todd Kashdan. He was a psychologist at George Mason University, and he did a study in his class. He did the psychological effects of two different activities, something that his students found to be immensely pleasurable, like scuba diving. And then the other one was a selfless act of kindness for someone else, like collecting clothes for the battered women's shelter. And remarkably, the latter option of service brought in consistently greater sense of happiness than the activity of pleasure. One of the surest paths to boosting your mood is giving to somebody else in need. Such giving can take on many forms. You have Habitat for Humanity, Big Brothers Big Sisters, serving at a local museum, serving meals at a soup kitchen, at animal shelters. There's also a couple websites you can look on. www.volunteermarch.org is one, and also justserve.org. Those are two great options for looking on for service opportunities. Because when we're forgetting ourselves and serving others, then our worries and our doubts kind of go away, and we can have a more broad perspective of life and what's going on. And just a couple more things before I close. Animals are super important. Animals can be a real asset to those with depression. Just a minute. Pets have a magical ability to increase our sense of well-being, and I have a little person here, so pardon me for being distracted. But animals can improve our sense of well-being through physical contact. It lowers stress hormones. They also provide a faithful source of social companionship and a deep feeling that we truly matter. And then the last part we'll cover is just finding community. It's really important that we have community. Like, it's an innate human desire that we're born with, that we belong to a community. And it's an experience that we crave. So some ideas for community are church. Church is a place that is like a safe haven for a lot of people. They find purpose there. Like, you invest in church because you are learning to give, whether you give like tithings or donations, your time and service. But you know what? Even if church isn't for you, there are many options for community. There are volunteer organizations, there are social organizations and clubs, There are self-help group interest groups, for example, like hiking, crafting, cycling, all sorts of interests that you might have. You can find groups, and that's a sense of commonality. There's also sports leagues, and that's a big one for my husband. He's enjoyed playing sports. And then, just a minute, the workplace, finding that commonality and community in your workplace. So just concluding thoughts, all of us are born to connect. We are hardwired to live in a company of those who know and love us. It is really important that we place our relationships on the top of our priority lists. And if we do, and we have the care and concern of our close friends and families, we're going to be considerably less vulnerable to depression. So thanks for being on. Drop where you're coming in from. What value did you receive from this? And then next week, we are going to be talking on Habits of Healthy Sleep, Chapter 9. So we're going to be talking about sleep and how sleep affects depression and what are some tools and tips we can do about that. So we'll see you next week. Thanks.